I'd like you to first start off with talking around, how you see the trade tension in the U.S., between the U.S. and China, bottoming out.
Well, I think it's very serious for the world, and it makes sense that people are very worried because it's not just about one particular trade flow. This is about IP, it's about Huawei, it's about steel, it's about manufacturing. And the reality is that the flows that go between the US and China and all of the value chains linked between the two of them affect the entire world. When we look at Africa, for example, Africa's single largest trading partner is China. America is number 5. And there are multiple value chains that are all tied up into the US-China trade cycle. So I think any talk of a trade war, people always lose. But I think Africa is particularly exposed because we're talking about the single most important trade partner for the continent.
So now as global trade is rebalancing now, then how should Africa position?
Well, I think Africa has an enormous possibility to get more involved in the international value chains. One of the big problems with Africa is there are a lot of commodities produced, but it's as if they appear magically at the beginning of the value chain. It might be cocoa, it might be minerals, it might be gold. But the miners or the farmers who produce them are, for the most part, invisible to the value chain. And there is an opportunity with the technology available now to connect them in. So I think there's a real opportunity, actually, that Africa, as there is a rebalancing of global trade and we see a lot more South-South trade, we could see a real benefit there where African value chains start connecting with the international value chains and ultimately get better value for their products.
All right, now let's look at China's play on Africa, especially on the digital front. When you look at how Africa's digital infrastructure has been put in place over the years, how do you see China's play in that mix?
Well, I think we're facing China-Africa 3.0. If you like it, China-Africa 1.0 was in the period after independence. That's when China built the Tazara Railway. That's when most African countries got things like a Ministry of Justice or a parliament building built by China. Then from the late 1990s, we had China-Africa 2.0, which was basically China saying, we will build you infrastructure in return for minerals. We saw that happen in Sudan, in Zambia, in Angola. And we also saw 1 million Chinese entrepreneurs come into Africa. But 3.0 will be digital. And that is because China has effectively built the digital infrastructure of Africa over the last 15 years. Most of the telecom masts that you see are either Chinese-made or Chinese-built or both. Most of the handsets being sold are either Transsion or Huawei. Probably 60 to 70% of handsets in Africa are Chinese. And now we're seeing the big Chinese media companies, the BAT, Baidu, Alipay, and Tencent moving into Africa. In December last year, WeChat formed an alliance with M-Pesa to enable payments from M-Pesa directly to China. We expect to see Alipay coming in soon, and really we could see the digital wave now of Chinese companies coming in, e-commerce companies, and sweeping the board because they've put the infrastructure in to enable this.
All right, now let's look at how the U.S. is also playing Africa then. When you look at the tariffs that they've imposed on China, on goods coming from China, how do you see any significant impact, and do you see it trickling down to Africa?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of concern, for example, over certain trade deals like AGOA. There was a question about the US whether they would renew that or not. That seems to be safe for the time being. There was also a lot of talk about will the American Export-Import Bank actually continue to put money on the table for American trade with Africa. That also seems to be continuing. But I think the real danger is that when it comes to these value chains, which are so complicated nowadays, if you think of a smartphone, even an iPhone, people assume that all of the value of an iPhone goes to America, but it's not the case. In the US, some of the value goes there from IP, software manufacture, but you'll have pieces of the iPhone being produced all over Southeast Asia, maybe assembled in China, but a lot of minerals coming from Africa. All of those value chains are tied together. So as soon as we start seeing tariffs being imposed and blockages, the disruptive effects are huge on Africa. And I certainly think when we look at the Africa-Chinese flows, that's where the risk is with this US-China trade war.
All right, but when you look at how the U.S. has also engaged in Africa, they've also come into, lodge in some very, very, very important sectors in the economy. For example, when you look at the Power Africa initiative.
Yes, well, I think basically the Americans have definitely, they've had periodically interested engagement in Africa. I think actually the George Bush era, George W. Bush, was perhaps the most prolific. There were a whole number of programs launched there, which have had a huge impact in terms of reducing communicable diseases and trying to attack things like malaria. We've also seen things like the Global Fund with the huge backing of the Bill Gates Foundation as well, trying to address things like tuberculosis, malaria. But the reality is actually that the Africa policy of the Trump administration is very unclear. It's pretty well known that Donald Trump has already referred to a country called Nambia. His knowledge of Africa is not great. But at the same time, I think there are Africanists in the American administration who are trying to push their agenda, and that is very much about free trade and investment. Ultimately, the American influence in Africa is surprisingly low. When it comes to foreign investment, it's one of the lowest foreign investors among the G8 countries. And in fact, in terms of trade flows, they've dropped to number 5 now with Africa, mainly because of Nigeria and Nigerian oil, which comprise most of it. The key trade partners for Africa are really China and EU. And it's really the US which is being pushed out of the picture.
All right, but let's look at China's infrastructure play on Africa. We understand they've been coming up with the Belt and Road Initiative. What do you make of this initiative?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that the BRI, as it's called, is a misnomer because the belt is actually a train route over land and the road is actually a sea route. But the important thing about the sea route, after going through various stops in Southeast Asia, is the key point of contact is Kenya, before the route then goes up through the Red Sea, Suez Canal towards Greece and Europe. So Kenya is going to be the entry point for connecting to the BRI. And I think this is hugely important for the project going on in Lamu Port at the moment, the expansion of Mombasa, a lot of discussions about pipelines in Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. It is going to be a key entry point. And we've also seen that, the digital infrastructure is being laid for this one as well. Some of the richest flows in the world go through the Indian Ocean from China, South Asia to East Africa. And so really the BRI is just reinforcing this trade route.
All right, thank you so much for your contributions on the show.